You're listening to a Pop House Network podcast for developers by developers. Welcome to Java Pop House episode 91. The different JDKs. Hey, my name is Freddie Guime. I'm one of your co-hosts here at the Java Pop House. Safely, socially distancing, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Bob.
Hi, Bob Paulin, independent consultant from Chicago, Java champion, Apache Software Foundation member, and CJUG chairman of the board.
Perfect. And if you haven't heard me before, I'm Freddie Guime, a Java champion. Work at Expedia Group. Author, speaker, all that jazz. So, before we dive in, this episode is sponsored by Datadog. Today's show is sponsored by Datadog, the monitoring and analytics platform for end-to-end visibility into your Java applications. Datadog provides customizable dashboards, algorithm alerts, and distributed tracing in one place to help you resolve detected Java problems faster. With support for over 400 technologies and automatic instrumentation for popular Java frameworks, you can start monitoring your Java applications alongside the rest of your stack in minutes. Start your free Datadog trial today to start monitoring your Java applications in real time. Listeners of this podcast will receive a free t-shirt once you install the agent and create one dashboard. Visit javapophouse.com/Datadog to get started. And we thank them for sponsoring this episode. Datadog has been a great sponsor, and they keep the mix on and the tapes rolling. So go visit them, javapophouse.com/Datadog. Now, this is going to be a fun episode because we're going to talk about a lot of the OpenJDK and a little bit of the licensing, a little bit of the OpenJDKs, and a lot of in the sense of what flavors there are. It's interesting because we discussed it on Offheap a lot, and we discussed it sometimes privately. But when we look at Java Pop House, we realize that we really never cover what were the changes on the Java ecosystem in terms of the JDKs. So this episode is going to be fun because we're going to dive into both a little bit of the history and the licensing, and then into what the new toys that we have for us to play with.
Yep, and this is going to even go beyond just OpenJDK, as we'll get into. Some of the distributors of the JDKs also have clean room implementations, different implementations of the JDK, such as OpenJ9, which is another complete implementation with its own licensing, its own even garbage collectors, which we're going to cover. So this episode is really dedicated to the JVM and all the changes that have kind of come about over the last couple of years. And frankly, if you haven't been paying attention and all you're using is your standard hotspot JVM, we're going to give you a lot of stuff to look into over the next maybe even couple weeks, to be trying out on your stack. So it should be a lot of fun just to experiment with the things we cover today.
Mm-hmm. So as we dive in, the very first thing is understanding sort of like what happened. And this is these are a couple of slides that I wanted to show on what has happened, right? Like a lot of things happen essentially after Oracle JDK just hidden. And the thing that really is, if you're using Oracle JDK 8 in production, and you don't have an Oracle contract, then you might want to revisit that. So what happened was that the licensing terms changed. Essentially the licenses, and let me rephrase that because that is something that it has to be like clear. Like licensing terms for Oracle JDK 8 never changed. They're still the same. They always have been. What they changed is that the Oracle decided not to do any more public updates. So if you're still on Java 8, just be aware that if you're using Oracle JDK, you're just probably not getting public updates unless you're paying a subscription to it, right? But the last update, Oracle Java 8 update that we have was on January 2019. So we are right now 1 year in, and security updates are very important. So you should have one. So the one thing that happens is that if Oracle JDK, which used to be the sort of like the free version that we used to go to, and an easy version to get to because you just have to go to, just search for Oracle JDK and you find, or even when you search for Java on Google, that's the very first link that you find. Now that might not be a viable solution if you're still on Nate, the one thing that we can do about it is move to what is called the OpenJDK, which is what most everybody is using. And this is where sometimes it gets confusing, the terminology, because even OpenJDK doesn't really tell the whole story, right? So let's start with a little bit of the background of what really happened. When Sun Microsystems actually created the JDK source code, it was not what we used to think as free and open source. Like this was essentially, what is it, like 25 years ago now, right?
It was all proprietary, like almost all software was at the time.
Back then, yeah.
GPL, I believe, was around, but was a kind of a rarity, outside the Linux kernel. But yeah, you didn't see all of the open source licenses. Apache Software Foundation, the Apache web server was in its infancy. So yeah, Java came from a time really before open source.
Yep. So, before it was mainstream, right? So,
Yes.
so the one thing that happened was that Oracle, what they tried to do is, when they took over, they bought Sun Microsystems. They did a very Herculean effort to essentially liberate the licensing of the source code. And what that means was that when Sun Microsystems created the code base, they did it not just by themselves, but in conjunction with Red Hat, IBM, and other players. And essentially the code that these other participants contributed to was encumbered, meaning that there were essentially, they essentially say, Oracle can use it, but nobody else can. So what they did was that, a lot of this happened, I think, between 1.6 and 1.7, where they hunt down all the particular copyright owners and ask for it to be part of the, essentially, the new Oracle license where everybody can actually look and use it. So what OpenJDK refers to is essentially that quote unquote liberated source code, where it's essentially unencumbered by copyrights, by commercial copyrights, and essentially if you really want to in your adventures, you can actually clone and do things with it, right?
Right, and again, the source code wasn't just Oracle license, so it's dual licensed, right? So it's also GNU with class path exception. Was the open source license that, not without controversy, that Oracle or really Sun settled on, and what allows the source code for the JVM to be put out there. It's kind of interesting. The open source license obviously comes with all of the grants that you would need to be if you were to compile it and use it yourself. However, the Java name being a copyrightable thing and the specs and everything from Oracle does make it a little bit complicated of whether, hey, can I actually distribute this software and call it Java? I mean, that's, kind of one of the bases of the Google Oracle Supreme Court case that should be heard, I don't know, any time now. It got delayed because of the coronavirus, but it's still on the docket for this year, as far as I know.
Correct. So what happens is that like Bob said, Oracle, essentially has this sort of like dual licensing model where the free and open source one is essentially the GNU
With class path exception.
GPL with class path exception. And the second one is the commercial one. Now, the thing that Oracle has done for the longest time was essentially they clone the OpenJDK source, they add some flavoring to it, and that was a lot of, if you're using Java 8, you might have heard about Flight Recorder, Java WebStar, Mission Control, which used to be the secret sauce that Oracle added to their commercial JDK. So when you actually pay for an Oracle license, you pay for the usage of these things. Now that has been changing a little bit because Oracle has been slowly but surely open sourcing these tools or contributing them back to the actual repos, which is kind of fun. So what used to be hard to get, like mission control, or you have to pay for it, now is essentially much easier to get. Not essentially, it's still sometimes you have to build it, but I think somebody is actually creating builds out of it. That is, you just have to just download and execute.
Yeah, some of those are actually from JRocket, from the acquisition that Oracle made to get the JRocket back in the day. So I mean, all of it's kind of come together into a single suite, and yes, it is kind of exciting. A lot of it's been open sourced and become part of OpenJDK.
Now this is weird because I thought that IBM J9 was an OpenJDK clone, but you're telling me that it
is so right. So it is and it isn't. So this is the fun part, right? So OpenJ9 does not have its own compiler. It relies on OpenJDK for a lot of the development kit tools around the JVM, but the runtime, what actually executes your Java bytecode, that is an implementation.
That's a clean room.
It's completely clean room. It's not hotspot, right?
Got it.
It's got a completely different set of garbage collectors, completely different, potentially performance characteristics. Although they do try to stay obviously very close to the specifications. There's obviously are differences, but at the end of the day, they have written a new runtime for the JDK.
So some of them is still right. So what has happened is that like once we have the OpenJDK and it was essentially free for people to actually clone. What people or what company has been doing is essentially cloning that OpenJDK and then saying, look, Oracle, we want to essentially benefit from the dual license. We'll pay you a royalty and then we can license it on our own. And what they usually do is they take the OpenJDK source and they add their own little things. Like, I guess IBM added their own like interpreter, right? And that's sort of like how the different JDKs that are out in the world happen. Oracle now has the Oracle OpenJDK, which is essentially the vanilla version of OpenJDK just built by Oracle. And this is when Oracle JDK and Oracle OpenJDK used to be two things. Now I think in today's world, they're just one and the same. And that means that all the stuff that used to make Oracle's JDK unique is already part of the main OpenJDK repo, like we said, for mission control, flight recorder, and all that. Now there are new players that are coming in, or there used to be not as known, but for example, Amazon Corretto did the same thing. So Amazon actually created essentially a clone of the OpenJDK. They sort of like add on and remove a little bit of the things. Like I said, like last time when I checked, but this was like 6 months ago, they removed some old secure ciphers because they are now considered insecure, because that's how as technology moves forward and computational power keeps growing, some ciphers that used to be safe 10 years ago are not safe anymore. So a lot of the Corretto is essentially removing some of the deprecated stuff, but that is sort of like what they do. They essentially take the code, the OpenJDK source, they compile it and offer it on their own.
Yeah, and what you'll see of almost all of these players that are now adding their own distributions, they all have their own kind of market or type reason for doing this. I mean, most of them aren't just doing it just for fun. They actually have a business reason for doing it. So Amazon's obviously, and we'll talk more in depth on the Amazon one as we get further through our agenda. They're much more focused in the stability of their AWS platform and making sure that the versions of Java they support are as secure and performant as they need to be for their customers. So their fork of the JDK is not necessarily, hey, we're going to add a bunch of new features and we're going to, do this and that differently. It's really just like, hey, it would take us some time to get this integrated in, or maybe the OpenJDK team may disagree whether this security feature needs to be removed when we need to for our customers. So we kind of forked it a little bit. So we're going to do it early.
Yeah. And a lot of that is what's happening on the sort of like the realm. And real quick, what I wanted to touch in is on Java 11, which is, and by that I mean 9, 10, and 11, and on the other ones. Oracle changed its position where the licensing for Oracle JDK 11. It is different. It is one that says that you cannot use Oracle JDK 11 in production unless you have an actual contract
license. Yes.
So if you're using Oracle JDK 11, then you really need to make sure that you do have a license, because this is not necessarily a security concern, but it's mostly a legal concern, because like they did change the terms, and that is what got a lot of people in a tiff when it happened, probably like 2-3 years ago. So a year ago, I guess. So that is one thing, but in that sense, a lot of the different OpenJDK builders, they still are like they do bring support. They don't charge a lot. Like Red Hat is one of the companies that is still contributes and updates OpenJDK 11. I think
they're the leads, actually.
They're the leads,
so when you look at when a release is put out there, an OpenJDK, and when Oracle, so we talked about the 6-month release cycle. When Oracle kind of says, "Hey, we're done with this release," Red Hat has actually picked up, I believe, the last two. I believe they're both the branch owner on 8 and 11. So both of the LTSs have fell to Red Hat, and that is basically the team or the person that is cutting the releases and kind of managing that branch of the code in OpenJDK. So Red Hat has been a major player.
And they've been good.
Yeah, no, they have been. I mean, you look at the Oracle releases and say, okay, I can get up to 6 months, because even the LTS in 11, once you get to that 6 month and once they cut 12, even though 11 is an LTS, the security updates ended for 11 on the Oracle
timeline. Yep.
Timeline. Now, Red Hat and the OpenJDK contributors, which are many companies, Azul, Red Hat, IBM, just to name a few. Yeah, I guess at this point, one of the same. Just to name a few, are continuing through and pushing security updates, potential performance improvements, not new features, right? Because once the releases are cut, there's your features. Every once in a while something may get backported, but nothing major. And that's how it's been.
Yeah. So and that is one of the things, like the one that if you just want essentially a build of the OpenJDK repository, adopt is always a fine choice. But I know that that Bob has a long list of things that we can play with.
Yes. So let's start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with, so we can start even at the OpenJDK. So what is OpenJDK and what do the builds look like? So the beauty of the java.net OpenJDK builds is you can get the bleeding edge things as well as early access to a number of the projects. So if you can see my screen here at the JDK, here, Freddie, I'm going to share with you so you can see my screen as well.
Yeah. Yay.
We have the JDK.java.net site, which I can get the ready to use stuff, which is JDK 14, Java Mission Control, which is another thing Freddie mentioned that Oracle has open sourced as a part of the JDK architecture. But you can also get early access to things like 15, which is not cut yet. It's just about to enter the ramp down phase next month. You can get Loom, which has been in the news a bit lately about
Loom.
Yes, some of the new concurrency architecture
Lightweight
that could be coming. Lightweight threads, but they've switched, and we have to cover that in another episode because they've kind of pivoted away from the fibers to more of like virtual threads, they're calling them now. So if you've looked at the Brian Getz treat, we've got some catching up to do on that. But you can play with the bytes already by going out to this website and downloading them. Many of the, not the early access, but many of the ready for use do have Java Docker containers too, if you're Dockerized in the cloud. But the one thing I would just keep an eye on is if you watch the OpenJDK mailing list, some of the Docker builds at the OpenJDK site are maybe not as well regulated as some of the other ones that we're going to talk about. And there's
that's the mystery meat.
The mystery meat OpenJDK builds. They've gotten better. I haven't heard of a mystery meat tweet out from Gil in the last couple months, but they've got a little check mark or a little X on this for a few releases of the JVM into the Docker repositories where the release hasn't really been the actual build. So you got to watch out for that.
Yeah, and I tried to remember like how did that ended up happening. I think it was so the OpenJDK versioning is fine. Like the repo is fine, the tags are fine, but I think it's something that because I think what they do is until they make the cut, the master is the newer, the quote unquote the next version. But I think that one of the policies of one of the Linux distributors, I don't know if it was Debian, says we always take from master and just build that. And whatever that is we're just going to slap that number in there because that's, what you build from master, which is considered, I guess it's considered a snapshot. But it just labeled, it's not what you think it is. Usually it's not yet cut from master. So things that sometimes people will expect from looking at the actual build number are not there. And the issue was, I guess the most dangerous issue is if you're running sort of like this security, sort of like this vulnerability scanners. A lot of the things that they rely on is to see what versions of things are you running? Are you running old Windows versions? Are you running an old Java version? And it could be that somebody patches something on master branch, 2.12, but your build of Java did not have it, even though it's reporting that it's 1.8.2.12. And that is sort of where the danger, quote unquote, of the mystery meat is. Not necessarily that master is unstable, but you can mislead thinking that you already have a patch or a vulnerability fix because of the version number, but you didn't.
You don't. Yeah. So, I mean, that's things to watch out for. So, the pivot off of this email is good because it leads us back into the company that Gil works at, Azul, talking about our next distribution, which is Azul Zulu. So Azul Zulu is the open source distribution of OpenJDK as released by the Azul team. Now this release, Azul builds their own JDK called Zing, which is a proprietary one, has its own garbage collector. Freddie, I know you used it, so you could talk all day about some of the cool things that they do to make their stuff fast.
Oh, yeah.
But they also do an open JDK build, which is free. So Zulu is free. And one of the nice things about dealing with a company that does their own proprietary version is they've purchased the rights to use the Java TCK. So the TCK is the test compatibility kit. And one of the good things and one of the reasons why I like using the Zulu JDK is because they use that license to the TCK and they run it against the OpenJDK builds on Zulu. So what you'll find, and when we start talking about some of the other releases, is not all of these distributions are run against the test compatibility kit, which is what Oracle uses before they release Java. It's how one of the ways that they say, hey, Java, this is
still
Java.
Compatible. Yeah,
right. It's still compatible. So they do that, and they have what the biggest reason I like using Zulu is there's a lot of rigor around their release process. They are, you can tell by Gil's email, they're very much on the ball with, okay, we're releasing what we're releasing, and we're being transparent about what's in these builds.
Yeah, no, and again, it's one of those where it might make economic sense too. We're not going to go into pricing sheets or anything like that, but Oracle is the main player, the one that will sell you the license. But sometimes for companies big and small, Zulu sometimes the support contracts are nice, so it might make sense.
Yep. So. And they do, and I'm going to go into just a quick demo as well. They do offer support for Zulu. If you want that paid support to get support for your Zulu builds or your Zulu development, you can do that. So here you can see my screen. I'm in a virtual box. So most of these examples I'm going to do with Docker. So if I'm going to just try to get the latest of OpenJDK, I can just do a Docker run Azul Zulu-OpenJDK, and that's going to start a Docker container for me. And if I check that out, I see it's an OpenJDK build 252, which is the latest at the time of this recording, 64-bit Linux. But if I want to get, say, some of the newer features, let's say some of the things that are available in JDK 9, I can switch the version of the container. And here, when I look at it, I'm going to get the version Java 9, so I can get things like JShell. So JShell is basically the REPL for Java. So if I wanted to use the REPL for the latest version of JDK 9, I can do that.
And for those who don't know, REPL is, the repeat evaluate loop. So you can essentially type in and then just see what happens. So like instead of having to create an actual Java project, you can just type in what you want, like system out print line.
Yep. So I can just kind of compile Java on the fly to test out my program. So the other thing that I would mention that's interesting about Azul is that they have a partnership with Microsoft as well. So if you're on Azul or Azure, Azure, they have specific builds of Zulu on the Microsoft site. And it was kind of interesting, and I don't know if this was intended or not, but when I was looking around at a couple of weeks ago, I was looking for that 252 release, and it was not on the Zulu Docker site, but it was on the Microsoft site. So there may be some kind of
they're getting
earlier updates.
Yeah.
Now they do have a kind of a FAQ out there for what are the Zulu for Azure. They kind of define what the partnership kind of entails, but this is free. It sounds like it's free as long as you're using it in Azure for those Microsoft Docker repos. So we can include a link to this in the show notes for folks that are interested. We don't always cover the proprietary stuff, but this was, Azul is basically providing some open source and then providing support and proprietary stuff. So it definitely makes sense to cover it. All right. I think that's all I had on Zulu. The next vendor or distributor I would talk about is probably the Adopt OpenJDK project.
Ooh, Martin.
Yes. So, so let's see. The folks that wrote this article is Java is still free, and they've been constantly updating it, talk about all of the releases and go into some of the things that we're talking about. We'll also include a link to this in the show notes. Adopt OpenJDK is another one, and it's probably one of the broadest of all of them. So if we go to the adoptopenjdk.net, they provide downloads of all their builds of OpenJDK and OpenJ9, which is that IBM implementation that we talked about earlier in the show. The OpenJDK build is essentially the hotspot, and they go all the way up to 14. As does Zulu, but they do not have a test compatibility kit like Azul does. So what they compensate with is they have a number of community written tests that they use before they distribute their JDK, which are all available through their GitHub. So they have basically their own build and release process that they've invested in order to cut these releases, create the Docker containers, and they have probably one of the widest availabilities of operating system combinations at their Docker repo out of all of these distributions.
And to be clear, like this one here is while Azul, Zulu, or OpenJ9 may do things different after forking the repo, Adopt is just a repo. Like it's whatever it is in the Mercurial repo, They downloaded it.
Soon
and
to
they
be
built
good.
it. Really?
Yes, they're moving OpenJDK to Git. I don't know if you heard about that.
Well, I always heard
out
about
there.
it.
Yeah.
It's like it's one of now. I'm one of those. Like I'll believe it when I see it. I'll believe it when I can clone the repo.
You can. Look at that.
Damn.
It's there.
Wow.
So yeah, no, it's out there, and some of the projects are out there. So if you're looking to look at the source code, they do have. I mean, this is read-only mirrors, but they do have it out there. But yeah, adopt. Some of the interesting things that you can do with adopt. I can start with a few more Docker containers. So let's flip over to that. All right. So one of the cool things about Adopt is, again, they're very cutting edge. They get those releases out there very quickly. So with Adopt, I can already get a release of JDK 14 soon after it was out there. And one of the cool things that they have in JDK 14 is what's called helpful null pointer exceptions. Oh. So if I have some code, let's say, and this is going to be really ugly code, code like this, where I have a class A that has B as a member variable, B has a C, and then class C is just kind of an empty shell. And then I create a new A, and then I do system out println A.B.C. Now this is a valid compilable statement, right? So, I mean, there's a C variable in B, there's a B variable in A, but we know based on this code, I never actually initialize B. even, yep. Right? But C is also null. But when I run it on this line, what happens with the null pointer? So let's actually just compile. First, let's compile. So if I Java C A, we can see that compiles. And now if I'm going to go run it, Java A, I'm going to get a null pointer. But all it tells me is that it's on line 5. And when you have a null pointer, is it the B? Is it the C? Is it the A? I have no idea which one of these variables is the null pointer. But with helpful null pointers in Java 14, I can set an extra flag command line on the flag on the JVM. So it's -XX : show code details in exception message. And then I can specify my class A. And then when I run this, it doesn't just say null pointer. It says it cannot read field C because local.b is null. So I know that it's not A, it's not that C is null. We never even got to C. B is my null pointer. So when I go back into debug my code, I don't have to stick a breakpoint there. I can immediately just assume B is null, and I have to fix that problem.
Yep. Oh, it's so many hours times wasted.
So very, very exciting to get Java 14, and Adopt OpenJDK has that at Java 14. But perhaps one of the most intriguing things about OpenJDK is that it also, the Adopt OpenJDK, is that it also supports OpenJ9. And we actually had somebody at CJUG, was it earlier? I think it was earlier this month. Dan Hedinga, I'm going to butcher his last name, but he's an IBMer, and he came to talk to CJUG about OpenJ9, and I picked up, I've actually been following it for quite some time, but there's a lot of cool stuff in OpenJ9 that makes sense to look at, especially if you're in a highly Dockerized cloud-based environment. Things that they've been working on probably a lot longer than the OpenJDK project, and because they have their own runtime, they can kind of make those changes to fit their own needs, essentially. The other cool thing about OpenJ9, and again, as we said before, OpenJ9 is just the runtime. They don't have their own compiler. It's just their own runtime. They're using the OpenJDK compiler. They have their own garbage collectors, so they don't have G1GC or ZGC. They have like a real-time collector, like a throughput collector. and then one other collector I'm drawing a blank on. So you have to deal with an entirely different suite of garbage collectors. And one of the interesting things I didn't know that I learned earlier this month is they actually have a single source branch. So Freddie, when you were talking about the OpenJDK builds, where they basically fork it and each release becomes its own branch, they build everything off of master for their releases. Which is kind of interesting. So it's like, from a code development standpoint, knowing that, I can backport things much more easily because it's all from a single source line, is kind of intriguing to see, in the long term, if that strategy helps them basically be able to support some things that, maybe an 8 that came out in 14 at the runtime. Right. So that's interesting. And then the final thing, well, I shouldn't say the final thing. The other thing that I think makes it interesting in a Docker container is they have this concept that they've started to meld into OpenJDK called shared classes, where basically you can set a flag, and at the start of the JVM, when it loads classes in the class loader, it'll actually write those things to disk. Which, when you think about having a JVM running by itself on its own VM is not really interesting. But when you have a Dockerized VM and you may have 6 JVMs running the same code, and you actually are storing the class files to disk, and you can load those shared formatted class files from disk rather than having to go through the whole Java startup. It does save some time on the startup. I mean, we tested it with with one of my clients' code, and we did see the restarts were a lot faster. The initial starts where it was writing them initially was slower.
Slow, yeah.
But when you started it with the shared classes the second time, where you had a new instance come up that had access to that via Docker volume or however you're sharing those shared class files, it did run a little bit faster on the startup. So that was interesting.
Ooh, nice.
And then the final thing that I'm going to talk about is something that's experimental in OpenJ9 that kind of blew my mind, just as a toy. Not something that I'm sure I'll be using in production anytime soon, but something that I want to play around with. And it's called the JIT server. So the idea here is that you can run OpenJ9. So I have it running here in a Docker container, and just like, you would run, Mission Control or any of the other Java tools, you can just run a command called JIT server. And what it does is it starts up a server over TCP. It might be HTTP, but I know it's TCP that can accept requests to JIT certain instructions. So if you have a client program, so over here, I have just basically test JIT. So it's a Java program that counts increasingly up. And I compile that. And if I run it just by itself, let's just run. Oops, we'll do Java test JIT class, or oops, that's not how that works. Do it like this. It'll just count, right? But if I run it with the special command -XX : plus use JIT server and then the class name, it'll actually connect to the other JIT that's run the JIT server for JITting the commands. So it'll basically outsource the JIT. Now, when you see this running, it actually looks like it's slower for a single instance, but when you have multiple instances, and they're all running the same code, and there may be benefits to having this approach, because basically you're taking all that CPU that would be used for the JIT and you're moving it somewhere else.
That's interesting, because a lot of it is like warming, especially because you do need to hoist and unhoist. Usually, once you JIT something, they might actually be candidates for not being JITted if some part of the code becomes hotter. So a lot of the stuff the hotspot needs to do is essentially that's why it has that name. It's like it needs to figure out, what is the new hotspot? And that means that I need to unJIT this particular thing or unhoist it and then rejig something different. And that does take, it is a pause on the JVM, trying to figure out, oh, okay, this is the part that I now need to put in my assembly or my JIT code in. So that's kind of fun, just outsourcing that to crazy that it actually works.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's pretty cool. I mean, it's one of those things. It's out there to play around with it. It's an experiment. So you can, OpenJ9 will run any of your Java code that runs on OpenJDK. So, I mean, you don't have to change your code to use it. You may have to change some of your command line settings. Like if you're setting G1GC, well, it's not there. Right. So your hyphen XX : use G1GC, not going to work. But they do have equivalents or their own garbage collectors that are meant to meet those use cases. But you don't have to change your code.
Yeah. No, and I know that there was, I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to cover. There's one thing I want to cover, but let me.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead. I mean, the only as from the technology, there is support for these. So I don't know if that was what you were going to cover. IBM does provide paid support for these JDKs, as well as jQlarity, which got bought by Microsoft. So maybe that's continued through Microsoft. I don't know. I don't have the update there. So go ahead. Yeah. What were you going to say?
So there were like two things, right? Like it's always a good idea to get a support contract, if you can afford it. I know that when you talk to Oracle, I think that their license was around, and again, everybody gets a different. That's one of the things. Everybody gets a different price sheet from Oracle, so I don't know what the what the rate is, but I think it was like $20 per CPU, per core, per instance, something like that. But like one of the things they do say is like and I just repeat the message that I heard, and then you can take it any way you want it. Is that if you decided to go with Oracle, they usually use some of those proceeds to reinvest into the OpenJDK. So that's the argument they put in is like, look, we might not be the cheapest, we might not be the stuff, but by signing up with us, we help contribute to the ecosystem. Just passing that message out. Everybody will make their own opinions on how that works out. But the thing that I wanted to go into a little bit was SDKMan. So.
Do you want me to pass control over for that, or
let's do that. So I can.
All right. So let me flip back to screen share. All right. Do you want to? I'm stopping. If you want to start.
And then share my screen, and then let's see screen 2, and let's see share. And I just want to make sure. Can you see my screen?
I can.
All right. So we've been talking about OpenJ9, Hotspot, Adopt OpenJDK, Azul. And not just that, we're talking about Java 9, 11, 14, so there's
so many options.
I know,
my head
right?
is spinning.
So the one thing that I like to say, like, is if you're starting to play with this, and you do want to play with it, one of the things that that is kind of hard to manage is that you start installing all these things, and suddenly you lost control of, like, oh my gosh, you get Cartesian explosion because it's different providers times the number of versions you want to run.
Wait, which Java home is set?
Oh God, so many times I've screwed up by that, right? So the cool thing is that SDKMan is not necessarily only for JDKs, but that is sort of like what they're like what we know it for. It's a nice way of you to actually manage all these things, and what it does is like it's sort of like a command line version that allows you to say, hey, now I want to use this JDK, I want to use this other JDK. And first let me just go in. This is essentially the curl command is how you install it. If you're running Windows like I do not despair. As long as you have Windows 10, you can actually run it through WSL, which I have to say that I don't miss SegWin as much. Like, actually, I uninstalled it from my computer so I can be completely on WSL. And what WSL is the Windows subsystem for Linux. So essentially here, what I'm doing is I am actually running an actual Ubuntu shell. Is essentially not as eccentric as Docker. This is not necessarily a Docker container, or if you can think about it, a Docker container that is fully supported or integrated in Windows. For
You're calling me eccentric for using Docker, Freddie.
Running different JDKs and Docker images. I don't know, man.
That's how I roll, man.
That's fine. To each their own.
No,
That's the
cool.
beauty.
I have not heard a single person say a bad thing about WSL. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this is cool that you're covering it.
So the one thing that allows you to is it gives you a command line, sort of like prompt where you can type in, like, for example, SDK list and Java, and it's gonna tell me all the different versions of Java that I can use.
You've been busy.
Yeah, right. Like there is Adopt OpenJDK, there is Amazon Corretto, right? Azul Zulu is there. Bellsoft, which I have not heard about. GraalVM, which we know and love. Java.net. Yep. SAP. That's an interesting one.
SAP machine.
Yeah. So the interesting part is, for example, let's say that I want to play with. Let's play with something different. Let's play with this one, right? 1107. So the only thing I need to do is I take this. And then I say SDK install Java, and then I give it essentially the particular identifier, and then it's gonna do it for me. Is essentially going in, downloading the Amazon Corretto Java, and then once it finishes, it's gonna essentially install it, say my Java home, set all this stuff in, and then so when I can just do Java version, and it's there. And the cool thing is that if I then need to switch to a different JDK, it's a matter of just saying a new default of all the ones that I already either have installed, downloaded, or even if I haven't downloaded, it will download and install it. So if you're starting to play with all these things, super, super easy to actually try to keep sort of like tabs on what you're doing. And this works. SDKMan is sort of like Linux native, but so it works for Ubuntu, it works for Mac OS, and it sort of works for Windows if you go through the Ubuntu shell. One caveat is that while it works on the Ubuntu environment, your Windows subsystem is still doing what your Windows subsystem is doing. Like if you install Java on the Windows side of things, it will still use that Java. But if you go through the WSL, through your Ubuntu shell, then you'll be using whatever SDKMan has in there.
Okay, so you'll get basically your user variables and your environment variables set in WSL according to what you do in here.
Yeah.
But you may have, like, if you go to your command prompt in Windows, you're going to get whatever you installed in Windows. So you could have different versions. Yeah,
so you'll be running different versions depending on where you are. So I recommend that if you're going to be a Java developer on Windows, if you're really committed to using different JDKs and stuff, think about, or at least consider doing your development using WSL. Because then you're essentially in an Ubuntu world where SDKMan works, and like we see here, Java version now is telling me that is OpenJDK 1107, but this is the Corretto version, and then it's
this looks much simpler. But you can always continue to be eccentric like I am and use Docker on a virtual box.
That's what the cool kids do, right?
Yes, I am the cool kid. But I mean, that's interesting, just to cover the Corretto, and we talked a little bit about that before. One of the things you'll notice when you look at the Corretto is they only cover the LTS. So you see the Amazon is a little bit skinny, but that's, again, kind of goes to their use case. They're doing it for their own AWS infrastructure to make sure that from a security and performance standpoint, they have coverage.
No, and then for example, there is, I'm trying to figure out, I think is, there is SDK. So I can do, other thing I can do is SDK use Java, and then I say now I want to switch to Adopt.
So that's one you already have installed.
Yep.
So you've now moved to one you've installed.
And then that's Adopt OpenJDK.
Adopt. Yeah, no, I mean, it's really fun with Adopt right now. So, I mean, I remember when they had first come out and they started doing their builds, and it was kind of like one of those things I was watching. Now they're finally at that level of maturity where it's like, I can tell my clients, hey, you can use Adopt as well. They've kind of got their ducks in a row, and everything is humming along.
Yep. Oh.
Uh-oh, miss.
Did I copy the wrong version? Yeah, I did. So,
But yeah, the beauty of Adopt though is like it is almost, I wouldn't call it a foundation, but it is its own separate entity that doesn't, there's no business. Are they a not-for-profit? I can't remember.
I think they are a not-for-profit.
I think they are a not-for-profit. So I mean, there is an organization, with Azul, with AWS, you're dealing with at least a corporation which has its own kind of interests. The Adopt infrastructure really is all about just, hey, we're just distributing an open source version of the JDK. There's no agenda there, as far as I can tell.
Yep. So it is, and it was built because like the Mercurial repo was out there. Essentially, the code was there, but there was no builds. So So, Martin Bervering and the London Java community, essentially, that's how it started, decided to pick it up and started creating and getting all the build machines and all that. So we're very grateful because they are one of the more popular JDKs out there.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's really cool. And if you have like a DevOps interest, all of their build code is out there on their GitHub too, in case you're interested in learning how to build the JDK in an automated way. They've got all that stuff out there as well. So some really neat stuff to look at. Yeah.
I mean, and it is one of those things that if you really want to try your chops at understanding how the Java, the Java code is there, and become one of the few that knows how the JDK works. The source is out there. If you start taking a look at it,
you can build your own.
You can build your. You can become like if you ever decided to go to that path, your programming life is taken care of because you always have interested parties saying like, oh, you're an OpenJDK contributor. Come, we need you. So
yeah, do you want to give them a Java test when you actually write code for the JVM? It's like that's
I don't know. I can tell you things you don't know about that particular.
Do you know how a hash map works? Yeah, I wrote the native stuff for it.
That's awesome. But yeah, so I think that is really all. Like my Growl VM installation is going through with SDKMan, and I'm sure it's going to be done by the time we finish the podcast. But
finish the episode, and we do have another episode on Growl that we recorded previously. So if you're interested specifically in the Growl VM, that is another distribution from Oracle. Mm-hmm. The Growl VM has both a community and an enterprise version of it. Mm-hmm. It has support for multiple languages and the native binaries. If you're interested in learning more about Growl, listen to our Growl episode. I don't remember what episode it is, but we can also include that in the show notes. And then the Medium article, is Java still free, is the one to look for if you're looking just for a quick reference of what the difference is between all these distributions. We covered a lot of ground tonight. Mm-hmm. So I understand if it's like, wow, my head's about to explode. I have so many things I have to try and so many legal things I have to think about now. It's all documented out there on the web as well. In this Is Java Still Free? It was an article written by a number of Java champions. It's been vetted over and over. Yep. It's on version 2.006b. It's like they're very diligent about making sure that people know where the JDK communities stand and what the implications of choosing a JVM is. But this is really a great thing for the entire community because now you have so many more options. Mm-hmm. You can align yourself to a vendor if you want to. You can not align yourself to a vendor. You basically pick and choose whatever path you want.
Yeah, it's a fun time to being a Java developer. Like that is the end of it. So with that, I think that's that's all what we have for this episode. I think that there's a couple of things that if you are being quarantined, just remember that we have more podcasts, right? Like we are. This is our second video podcast, so we'll see how it goes. Knock on wood. So if you haven't realized that, now we actually have video if you want to actually watch us and not just listen to us.
On YouTube at the Java Pub House channel.
Yep. Or, if you're subscribed, you should be able to be getting it. And if it supports, and if your RSS reader or your podcatcher supports video, you should be able to see it there too. Remember that we're after this, we're actually going to be recording off heap. That's going to be our first video recording of Java off heap. If you ever wanted to see our faces, that's your opportunity to do it right there. That's coming up.
Wait, we agreed to show our faces?
Oh, God, boy. Yeah. It's going to be quarantine faces. We got it. All right. Yeah, I know. I need a haircut so bad. Then, do remember that we also have, Bob and Josh do break into open source. That's our, the open source podcast about how to use and contribute to some open source projects. And we also have the Stack podcast with Keto Man, where we cover things, that are beyond Java. So if you're more of a front-end UI person that, deals with that other Java star framework, you can listen to that. So that's all what we have. And, that's it. Thank you for listening.
All right, well, be safe, everyone, and follow us on Twitter at Java Clubhouse.
Perfect. Happy programming.